We all live in the shadow of our parents. Svetlana Alliluyeva, the daughter of Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, knew this better than most. Joining us now for more on her life is Rosemary Sullivan. She is the author of Stalin's Daughter, The Extraordinary and Tumultuous Life of Svetlana Alliluyeva. Hello, welcome to the agenda.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's set this up a little bit. I'm going to read a quote from your introduction of the book about Svetlana. Here we go. What would it mean to be born Stalin's daughter, you ask? To carry the weight of that name for a lifetime and never be free of it. In the USSR, Stalin was mythic. He was the Vodz, the supreme leader who built the Soviet Union into a superpower and won the war against the Nazis. To his millions of Soviet victims, however, he was the man responsible for the terror and the infamous Gulag. In the West, he was widely demonized as one of the world's most brutal dictators. Try as she might, Svetlana Alliluyeva could never escape Stalin's shadow. As she lamented, "Wherever I go, whether to Australia or some island, I will always be the political prisoner of my father's name." Pretty good setup for the kind of life she faced in your book. It's a big one. Really is this intimate portrait of this woman. What interested you initially about her? Why write a book about it?
I was working on another project with my editor in New York, and it actually fell through at the last minute. And it was exactly when the obituaries started to appear in the Globe, the Times, and so on. And that very sentence, "I will always be a political prisoner of my father's name," just astonished me. I'd written 4 biographies for that by then, 3 of them about women. And I thought, what could a woman's life be to be in the shadow of her father? And in another obituary, she was asked, quoted as being asked, "Do you regret your life?" And she said, "I don't regret my life. How can you regret your life? Perhaps I do regret that my mother didn't marry a carpenter." Yeah. And I thought, this must be a very interesting woman. So that was the hook. Also, I've always been fascinated by the Soviet Union. I went there for the first time in 1979. You know, my generation grew up on Mandelstam and Solzhenitsyn and Akhmatova, etc. So I thought, well, why not? Give it a shot.
Okay, and the shot turns out to be this, as I said, intimate portrayal of Svetlana's life. Let's just, in a general sense, given what you just said, like she's quoted as saying, you would imagine, anyone would say, well, this relationship must have been horrendous between father and daughter. But in a general sense, how would you characterize this relationship, this father-daughter relationship?
I don't think we ever get over our fathers. And we will go into this in a few minutes, but when Svetlana's mother committed suicide when she was 6½, the only person there that was family was her father. I mean, she had 2 brothers and relatives, but her father actually was sentimental about it, about having a daughter. Khrushchev used to say that it was like his relationship with his daughter was like that of a cat to a mouse, and yet he always wrote her loving letters. It was he called himself your loving daddy, the peasant Joseph Stalin. It was because so much of her life was fraught. The kind of stellar center of love was her father. So that as she gradually began to understand who he was in the politics of the Soviet Union, it was shocking to her. And that contrast between that period when he did love her, she felt, and the man she discovered slowly until she defected in 1967 in outrage, left her with this paradox. She did, in fact, end up rejecting her father, but it was like taking a part of her soul.
Yes, it would. I mean, we saw those photos. I think we had one up there of him holding her. I mean, it doesn't look unlike any other father holding his young daughter. And if you don't know the reality of the life your father's leading, that's what you know. Okay, so her mom, Nadia, commits suicide at age, when she's very young, when Svetlana is very young. What is their relationship, as short as it was, what was their relationship like?
She said she only remembered her mother holding her once. She felt her mother was a disciplinarian, a Bolshevik disciplinarian, and was more interested in her behaving and in her education. The one thing she remembered about her mother was her perfume when she put her to bed at night. So, in fact, in this family, Nadia was distant, Whenever anything was wrong, Svetlana would run to Papa, who would greet her with tobacco kisses. And apparently when Stalin was in a rage, the only one who could calm him down was Svetlana, who would wrap her hands around his boots, and then he'd be quiet. There was one instance where Nadia slapped Svetlana, not something, there was normally not physical violence in the house. And Stalin came running to defend his daughter. So that loving relationship blossomed in her mind as the warmth in that household.
And just to round out this nuclear family, in the early days, there are two brothers. Yakov, what's the other one's name?
Vasily.
Does Stalin treat the boys any different than he does his daughter?
Poposhka, yeah. His oldest son, who was about 17 years older than Svetlana and a kind of protector for her, was born to his first wife in Georgia, and that wife died shortly after giving birth. And Stalin went off on his revolutionary activities, usually one Siberian exile after another, and didn't see the boy till he was about 14.
This is Yakov.
Yakov. When Yakov was moved to Moscow with the rest of the family, the Svanitses. And Stalin was not enamored of his son. It was suggested by some people, including Svetlana, that what Stalin didn't like was that Yakov only spoke Georgian, not Russian. And it was very important for Stalin to mitigate, let's say, his Georgian origins as the leader of Russia. His second son, Vasily, was a kind of wild boy. He lost his mother when he was 11, terrible age for a boy. Started drinking when he was 13, started imitating in a kind of tin pot dictator way his papa, throwing around his weight, race cars, planes, girlfriends, 4 wives, and died at the age of 41 of alcoholism.
Yeah, ultimately drinks himself to death. Okay, so let's back up for a sec, because now we've got this family portrait. The daughter has a privileged place in this family.
Yeah.
This relationship, father-daughter bond, is extraordinarily strong.
Yeah.
Given who this family was, what's the expectation of Svetlana from her father? What kind of girl is she expected to be? What kind of woman is she expected to be?
Well, let's back up slightly, because Svetlana, before her mother's death, used to spoke of that period of her childhood, to the age of 6½, as that period of sunshine. Because they lived in the Kremlin across from the Horse Guards Palace, inside the walls. It was almost a community. It was only 8 years after the revolution. It was still a rather modest kind of life for the head of state. But there would be birthday parties and so on. And Svetlana was completely unaware that outside, you know, there was mass starvation, collectivization, famine in the Ukraine. The family would go to the country dacha, the Zubalovo. And it was like a Chekhovian, a little bit blacker, but a Chekhovian family, because the grandma and grandpa would come, and all the relatives and the friends and the Politburo members who, for Svetlana, seemed to be, like Kirov, seemed to be wonderful people who played with animals. She was completely unaware of what the world outside was, as any child would be. What did Daddy expect of her? He wanted her to be a good communist. He wanted her educated and disciplined. In fact, there's a very amusing moment in the book when he says to her, "Never ask command." And he plays this game in which she writes letters to him as first secretary, and writes, "First secretary, I command you to take me to the cinema." And she was able to command all the, you know, to Khrushchev. Third secretary, I command you to take me to the new metro. And Stalin would respond, I submit, first secretary, etc.
So it's interesting, because she's kept ignorant deliberately, but almost suggesting, I think, you're suggesting that she was kind of indoctrinated.
Not only kind of, she was completely indoctrinated. Until the age of 16, you know, I think of Ginsberg's wonderful book, Into the Whirlwind, Journey into the Whirlwind. And even in 1979, when I was in the Soviet Union, I realized how closed a society it was. By 1928, you know, 2 years after, or 29, 3 years after Svetlana was born, was the period of the Great Turn, when the forced collectivization of the peasants and the deportation of the kulaks, who were supposed to be the rich peasants. If you owned a cow, you were rich. You know, they had the political atmosphere was extraordinary, and it was suffocating. It was impossible to know what was going on, no matter who you were. You walked down the street and you'd see a sign which said, beware of enemies of the people. Industrial saboteurs, etc. And so the society was divided, and people really believed there were enemies to the Bolshevik revolution that was trying to undermine this utopian ideal. One of Svetlana's aunts, Maria Svanitze, kept a diary, and she talks about, I had no idea there were so many enemies. As Stalin went after one rival after another among the old Bolsheviks, Maria believed these were real enemies until she herself was arrested.
So through the 30s, as Stalin's like killing hundreds of thousands of people, Svetlana, you believe, was truly unaware of what's happening at the beginning when she's a young child, but as she gets older, what does she become sort of aware of what's going on?
She's 11 years old. Remember what it is to be 11. You're inside a protected family. Her aunt and her uncle are arrested in 1937. They must have done something. This must be a terrible mistake. What could have happened? And of course, she didn't realize they were executed in 41, 42. The first time she really begins to understand that things are wrong is in 1937. Suddenly she has a guard who takes her to school. The guards have their own canteen. And she watches as young friends disappear. And there's one particular young friend, Misha, who she used to write little letters to, little love notes. And suddenly Misha disappears because his parents have been arrested as enemies of the people. And she begins to think something's very wrong. But how can she conclude it's her father? Because you have to remember that up to the Second World War and then after, Stalin had consolidated his power with this cult of personality, and no one could question Stalin. So she was not unique in being completely puzzled.
But help me out here, Rosemary. Is there any evidence that she, like any 11-year-old kid would say, it's like, Dad, or Mom, Dad, she's not Mom, Dad, I don't know what's going on, explain this to me. Is there any evidence of what he would tell her?
When a little girlfriend of hers came to Svetlana with a note, the child's father had been arrested. And so the mother asked her daughter to give this note to Svetlana. She brought it to her father over dinner, and her father was furious with her and said, never do this again. And she said, but I love my friend. And he said, the police, the NKVD, are never wrong. But then, in fact, the father was released after a discussion. So she really did begin to understand her father had that kind of control. But remember, when she went to Model School 25, she'd walk up the stairs, and here would be a picture, a huge picture of her father and of Lenin. His portrait was all over the city. It was not possible to question Stalin.
When does it start? I know there's many moments that things start dawning on her, but when is that moment that she's like, maybe you're not the guy I think you are?
When she's 16. When she's 16, before that, his discipline was like that of any father. You're short, your skirt is too short, I want you to wear long baggy pants, you're looking, provocative. But when she was 16, she fell in love as only a 16-year-old can with a very famous filmmaker called Alexei Kapler. He was 38, a bit of a womanizer, but he was totally drawn to Svetlana because of what he felt was her independence of mind, her freedom of spirit, her intelligence, and a love affair began. It was platonic. You know, they'd walk through the park, her hand in his pocket with the NKVD guard behind watching. And again, there's a kind of naivete, but you have to get yourself inside that Soviet society. She thought the guard was her friend and protecting her. But of course, he was reporting to Stalin. The affair went on, if you want to call it an affair, for a while. She They would phone each other and whisper on the phone. They'd visit the opera and the galleries together. Stalin had her phone conversations taped. He had constant reports on who she was seeing, what she was doing. But then Kepler made the terrible mistake of publishing a letter in Pravda when he was in Stalingrad and writing back and saying, "I can see you leaning out of the Kremlin." And the only person, so as soon as he identified Svetlana without not using her name, he was immediately arrested. He had been warned, and people asked him later, "Why didn't you take the warning?" And he said, well, there was some degree of self-respect in not being intimidated. He was arrested, spent a year in Lubyanka, and then was off to the Gulag for 4 years. That moment was devastating for Svetlana, and she always said that broke her life. At that moment, she realized it was her father whose word determined who lived and who died.
That was her epiphany.
That was her epiphany.
Your book has so many interesting nuggets. Yakov captured by the Nazis upon the sons. Stalin refuses to save him, and I shouldn't say that with such astonishment, given what we know who Stalin was, but he didn't save his own son. Didn't try to do anything.
Again, you have to remember, we're talking about Russians. What we don't always acknowledge, I think, is that the Soviet resistance to Nazism saved us all. Hitler expected to invade Russia, and the war would be over in a couple of weeks. In fact, the Russians, their strategy and organization, their sabotage, and their winter prolonged the battle. So when Yakov was arrested at the very outset of the war, Stalin already had a rule. Any Russian soldier who surrendered was a traitor and would be executed. In 1942, he had an order proclaimed that the family, the wives of those arrested, of those soldiers who surrendered, would be arrested. When Yakov, his son, was arrested, to me the extraordinary thing was his wife, Julia, was immediately put in the Lubyanka. You do that to your daughter-in-law? Then in 1943, when the Germans wanted to arrange an exchange of this very important prisoner, the son of Stalin, for a general, Stalin said, "I cannot exchange my son for a general." When I talked to family in Russia, where I spent a month interviewing people and going to archives and so on, the family did not fault Stalin for that. They said, how could he save his son when so many sons were dying? But Svetlana did. She never forgave her father for not saving his son.
What does this girl have in common with her father as she gets, post 16, the article in the paper and stuff? Does she have anything in common with her dad?
It's such a tricky question and a good question. When I've interviewed her nephew, Sasha Berdonsky, who is the son of Vasily, Vasily had abandoned his children when he left his first wife and married a second wife. They were literally kept in a room and almost starved to death, these two children. So he had no love for his father. But when I said to him, well, your father was a bit of a kind of clone of Stalin, but Svetlana was so different, he said, no, you don't understand. Svetlana had her father's intelligence. She had his will. She just didn't have his evil.
You seem to suggest, though, Rosemary, that at least in the early, she had his ear as well. So given that they have those shared things, intelligence, and she seemingly has some influence over her dad where no one else seemingly did. Did she ever try and bend his ear?
Again, you didn't bend the ear of Stalin.
She knew well enough.
Yeah. I mean, she tried. There was a point when, in 1947, he arrested one of her favorite aunts, Xenia, and she tried to write a letter in which she said, you've been listening to gossip about Xenia, listen to the gossip about me, you know it's false. I must talk to you. But it was clear by 1949, 1950, she'd say that when she tried to talk to her father, she had to be careful who she spoke about because it could compromise them, who she didn't speak about could, in the end they talked about gardening.
Safe.
Yeah.
Would be safe, right?
And not safe for her, safe for those people around her whom she had to protect. She understood that, you see, she wanted people to recognize that when they talked about Stalin as a madman, they were completely wrong. He was not a madman, but he was part of a system. She said, I love the Yugoslav writer Gilas's portrait of Stalin. He said there were 5 Stalins. And whenever you confronted Stalin, you didn't know which one you were going to have. But if it was the charming Stalin, you were pulled in completely. If it was the terrifying Stalin, you were in real trouble. He was a consummate actor. And so to expect that somehow Svetlana might have influence over him in any way that was political. Stalin kept his private life absolutely secret. When a friend might say Svetlana could move her father, it was only in that tiny little domestic realm. But she wasn't allowed to, she was never able to attend any public functions, appear as the daughter of Stalin. Even though there was a perfume called Breath of Svetlana, and she was a myth in the public view, few people knew her.
She had a big life, and we're sort of going to talk about it in chapters because part of her life is in the former Soviet Union, part of it is in the U.S. We'll talk about the U.S. stuff tomorrow. But I want to say, so when her dad dies, I mean, we sort of talked about the quote, imagine being Stalin's daughter. So when her father passes away, what does she think?
She was pulled out from school. She was kept from him. She would phone. She was worried because she knew he wasn't well. She would phone his Kuntsevo dacha, his private dacha, where he lived. He didn't live.
She's how old at this point?
She's about 28.
Okay.
He didn't live with his children. As soon as Nadia died in 1932, he moved into his own dacha and would leave every night. I mean, that gives you a sense of the ambiguous warmth of Papa. When he was dying, she would phone, and she was told by the secret police, do not call. Finally, a car is sent. She arrives, and she sees all this fuss around Stalin, doctors being brought in, but this was the period of what is called the doctor's plot. So most of the specialists were in prison and unable to help him. He was suffering what would be a terminal cerebral hemorrhage. And at the last moment before he died, apparently he raised his arm, and for Svetlana that was a gesture of menace, a gesture of hatred, a gesture of fear of death, a gesture of anger at everyone around him. For Khrushchev, it was the last jerk of a dying organism. But for her, at that moment, she thought, I did love this man. I did not love what he became. He emptied himself and turned into this burnt husk who had dissolved every human instinct in him to power. But she wanted to remember the man who was her father.
And as we look at modern day dictators, you almost see this, not exclusively, but it is quite common that father dies and child, even if they mostly have fraught relationships with these people, they suddenly find maybe not suddenly, they have a thirst for power. She was like, I don't want to do any of this, I'm out.
No. She detested politics. She detested politics. No. In fact, she hoped that her father's death would bring a liberation. And interestingly, she said, there was no liberation. We continued to be haunted by the shadow of my father. Some of us deferred, some of us tried to resist, but in the end, Stalin's ghost remained until Khrushchev published his secret speech in 1956. And then the cat was out of the bag.
This is where all the secrets are revealed. And what does Svetlana do? How does she feel at that moment?
She's invited by Stalin's minister Mikoyan to his house. He was a family friend. He says, oh, I have something for you to read. Let me know what you think. And she goes upstairs and reads the secret speech and writes, at least, that she couldn't dispute it. It was all true. Khrushchev accused Stalin of the cult of personality, of creating the notion of enemy of the people, of false arrests and confessions under torture. It was a devastating attack on her father. At that point, she was a researcher at the Gorky Institute, very famous institute, among whom were her fellow students such as Andrei Sinyavsky, who would become a famous writer. And she's sitting there in the auditorium as the institute is hearing the secret speech in detail. Can you imagine? And so she gets up to leave, and Sinyavsky takes her coat from the cloakroom and puts it over her shoulders, and she bursts into tears because it was a gesture of acceptance. So some people could separate her from her father, most couldn't. And she retreated into a kind of terrible darkness. Her friend, an actress, Kira, describes meeting Svetlana, and Svetlana at that point wouldn't go out except to hear music because she might run into attacks on her father.
This is a good place to leave off our conversation because Svetlana goes on to try and rebuild her life. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Thank you for this. Appreciate it.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.